Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Remorowski, the Executive Director of SPME and ESMIA, and it is my pleasure to once again welcome you to our webinar speaker series. This afternoon, we have the pleasure and opportunity to host our friend and colleague, Ilan Troen, who'll be talking to us about his latest book that just came out, and proudly show a copy of his book that I recommend to all, entitled Israel, Palestine, and World Religion, Whose Promised Land? He will discuss a lot of the research and the work that has gone into this latest project that Ilan has done. Ilan is a prolific researcher and historian who has been involved in Israel studies for many, many years, and is worth everything that he's done is worthwhile reading. And we're glad that we're able to learn and share that we can learn from him this afternoon. The format will be as follows. Those of you who've been with us in the past know the format will be as such. Ilan will talk for about 30 minutes or so, then we'll go into Q&A. We have a lot of people who join us this afternoon. There'll be a lot of questions, so we will do our best to get to all the questions in a timely fashion. If we don't, feel free to email us after the webinar. But all questions should be typed in via the chat, and I will do my best to get to all of them. So really, without further ado, Ilan, thank you for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Asaf. This is a special thrill for me. Two of my favorite organizations are ESMIA and SPME, and I've been a member of both, and SPME for a very long time. I've also been teaching Israel. And if you teach Israel, you teach on the conflict. Although I had never until this book actually addressed the conflict quite directly. The decision to address the conflict became inevitable as a result of the kind of times through which we're living, as well as two seminars that I participated in. One was a Christian-Jewish dialogue, and the second was studying with Peter Berger, who was a sociologist of religion, who taught us meaning scholars from all over the world, that people may live on several levels at the same time, and that modernism is not the inexorable consequence, or does not inexorably lead to secularization. People can be secular and somehow live on a religious plane at the same time, and that's what this book is about. It is about Israel, Palestine, but Israel and Palestine are located in the Holy Land. And that makes for a difference, and that makes for a different kind of an analysis. So what the book does, and what I've been about, is trying to tease the differences and the interactions between secular claims to Israel and religious claims to Israel-Palestine. And the analysis really begins with the First World War, that was revolutionary in many ways. One of them was that claims to the Holy Land had really been settled centuries ago. After all, the Muslim world controlled Palestine, or what was Palestine, or variously labeled at different times since the 7th century. And only when a Christian power, Britain, decided that this Holy Land, which had been Muslim, aside from intermittent years during the Crusades, that it would be handed to the Jews, was there a need to rethink, refashion, and adapt theology to the kind of discourse that takes place in the modern world. After all, in the modern world, you don't go to the League of Nations or the United Nations and give a kind of discourse that you would give in your mosque, your church, or your synagogue. You need another kind of discourse. So this is about teasing out the kinds of discourses that take place in the 20th and 21st century, and that became essential even for those who were tied to theological discourses until the 20th century in the kind of revolution. Major point is a theological and a secular discourse may actually complement one another. They may support one another. Part of my task is to disentangle them and to indicate where they interact, where and how they are tangled. Let me give you a couple of examples. We now live in a time when a very avowedly secular leftist groups claim to support a fundamentalist jihadist organization? How do you explain that the left speaks the language of and forgives the kind of discourse and actions that are carried out by a jihadi Hamas organization? Or, as you will find as you read the book, Asaf, is that the colonial settler paradigm is actually, in my understanding, a secular form of supersessionism, which since St. Augustine is the way in which Christianity and, in a sense, also Islam looked at Jews and Judaism. And then how do you deal with the terminology Arab land and Jewish land? Are those secular terms? Or what is the theological basis of Arab land and Jewish land? And finally, you can look at events that take place at the United Nations and find that it is the Islamic bloc that leads the charge against the legitimacy of a Jewish state, not just states willy-nilly, happenstance, by accident. In short, we're not dealing with a normal geopolitical issue. We're dealing where issues like nationalism and national interests are at the core. We're dealing with something where, to be sure, there's nationalism, and where there are traditional or modern interests at stake, but there's something else. And that something else are the ways in which people view the same territory through the prisms of very different religious cultures. So how did we get to, the issue is not how we get to religion, because that's the way in which people until the very modern period have justified not only their rulers who rule by divine right, but how land is claimed, which is in hoc signo victus, and this in his name or in this sign we conquer. But how do we get to secular explanations or justifications? I suggest here on the screen, it begins in the Enlightenment. My favorite figure is Hugo Grotius, who argued that one needs to develop an epistemology based upon as if God did not exist. Now, understand about Grotius is that he was a deeply religious person, but what he was seeking was an epistemology, a way of learning about the universe and its laws and its functioning, in addition to that which he learned from revealed religion. One of his students is John Locke, the labor theory of property, which becomes essential if you look at the American experience. And Locke, however, is not a secular individual. Almost all of his examples derive from the Bible. These are religious people who are looking for a new language. Marshall considers himself a deist, not a Christian. However, many of his ideas, and particularly from Jefferson to Marshall, is a very sharp transition to a search for a language which is apparently totally secular, but which is, again, I will suggest to you, has strong religious undercurrents. Marshall is the key here. In the 1820s and 1830s, under the Cherokee Indian land cases that came before the Supreme Court, Marshall finds the ways in which Americans can justify the control over the continent out to the Pacific. And his categories of legal thought are quoted till this day and become the ways in which we claim land, or land is claimed, without invoking divine imperatives. Terms like conquest, treaties, discovery, who gets to the North Pole, who gets to the bottom of the ocean, who gets to new planets, has implications for the political powers of those who get there first. Labor, that's Locke, the improvement of land. Nut gatherers have some rights, shepherds have some rights, but the farmer has more rights than all. Purchase, that's obvious. Now, those items that I've listed first were developed in the 19th century. By the 20th century, post-Marshall, as I indicated, there are new concepts, and they are indigeneity, and that leads us to concepts like anti-colonialism and colonial settler paradigm, and the notion of self-determination of peoples. These are thoroughly modern 20th and 21st century concepts that Marshall never imagined. All right, to the beginning. I'd like to quote Rashi, whose interpretation of the first words of the Bible, Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning, God created the earth, is a way of saying that the entire world belongs to the Holy One, blessed be He, and He assigns it to people. And if you read Rashi, He assigned the Holy Land to the Jews. But if you read other texts, He assigned it to Christians, and yet other texts, it is Dar al-Islam. God assigned it to Islamic peoples. That notion of the importance of God carries through to the Mayflower Compact, which is the first significant document in the history of the United States that deals with the ways in which land is claimed, and it invokes God. By the time of Jefferson, and certainly in the present period, during the time of Marshall, God is erased, and there are other justifications. Let me give you an example of how this works. Among the categories that Marshall invented or talked about was discovery and labor. And probably the single most contentious issue after the First World War and until the United Nations vote on the partition of Palestine in 1947, the issue was how many people could be in the land, and of those, how many of them could be Jews. And the issue was the economic absorptive capacity of Palestine. Now, that created one of the largest scientific enterprises of that part of the 20th century. There were archaeologists, biblical scholars, historians, geologists, economists, you name it, they're all there. Ancient historians, contemporary historians. And it fills libraries of literature. And the fact is that in the time of the Balfour Declaration, there were maybe 700,000 people in what was Palestine. Today, there are 14 million. It grew 20 times in a century. Yet the British decided to accept the position that the land was going to be overcrowded if too many Jews came in, and therefore they reneged on the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, which offered that Palestine would be reconstituted as the Jewish national homeland. My point here is that may be the only case where, among the kinds of arguments that have been made about to whom Palestine, Israel, the Holy Land belongs to, has a kind of scientific verification. By and large, the kinds of language that's used is philosophical, it's historical, it's based in the social sciences and laws, but it is not verifiable. It depends upon the kinds of beliefs that people bring to the issue, and those beliefs are informed very often by the religious culture of the person who holds those positions. Indigeneity. Well, indigeneity becomes one of the post-Marshall concepts, and it's one of the most contested issues till this day. Indigeneity is, after all, a historical idea. And when it was first used in the 1920s, it really meant who had the most people and, to some extent, how long they'd been living there. But it lacked the kind of legal and political moment that it developed in the 1960s until the United Nations Declaration on Indigeneity of 2007, which attempts to ascribe rights to those people who are indigenous. The issue is who is indigenous in many parts of the world. Now, the idea of indigeneity began in Central America, and it really refers to pre-Columbian peoples. And it therefore was extended to the Aborigines in Australia, New Zealand, the first peoples in Canada, and to the Indians in America. But it's very difficult to apply to those parts of the world which have very mixed populations since time immemorial, well before Columbia and through the present, the Columbian discoveries and through the present. Let me give you an example. In the 20th century, after the First World War, when claiming land becomes important and is a basis for claiming states, all kinds of people in the Middle East are scrambling to make claims for their indigeneity. The Maronite Christians of Lebanon claim that they are but the ancient Phoenicians in modern garb. The Copts claim they are not merely Muslims, nor are they merely Christians, but they are descended from the pharaonic Egyptians. Should you go to the National Museum in Ankara, if you're not Israeli and can go there, you will find that the early rooms are devoted towards Hittites, because the Turks, despite their Islamic culture, claim that they are really a Hittite people. Now, the Jews, in addition to the biblical claims, around 1940, the Canaanite movement begins. They claim that they are also an ancient people rooted in the Middle East. After 67, when Pan-Arabism suffered a demise with the defeat and then the death of Nasser, all kinds of people that previously defined themselves within the mold of Pan-Arabism looked for local roots. The Hashemites, who were clearly transplanted from the Hejaz or what is Saudi Arabia, they lost out to the Saudis. If you look at their currency after 1967, you will find Hussein, a Hashemite king. On the one hand, is Al-Aqsa, and on the other hand, there is that stone fortress near Aqaba, which is called, I can't remember right now. But he claims that Petra. It's Petra and Al-Aqsa, because the traditional focus of the Hashemites they were defenders of holy places. The Palestinians all of a sudden see themselves as Canaanites, specifically Jebusites. They predate David. And the Christians, and this becomes terribly important, as I hope I will have time to show, see that they are descended from the first generation of Christians. They are the living stones, and upon them the new church is going to be built. In short, there are attempts to use history by being connected with the first in a continuous basis to make claims about the present. Palestinian liberal theology, Na'im-Atik, terribly important. And that's the quote from 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, that they are the foundation stones. The only evidence he brings is about as good as the evidence that the Phoenician connection to the Maronites is, or the pharaohs, descendants of the pharaohs out to the Copts, is that Atik in Arabic, as in Hebrew, means ancient. Now, what's fascinating about this in the Palestinian liberation theology is that this becomes the guiding intellectual and historical justification for what becomes the steady guide within the Presbyterian churches in America beginning around 2011 in a book called Zionism Unsettled, and it becomes but a way of talking about colonial Jews or Israel or Zionism as being colonial settlerism, that they obviously are outsiders, we are the natives. And Mitri Rahib is a Lutheran liberation theologian from Bethlehem, calls that kind of analysis theopolitics. It's a good name. The theopolitics of settler colonialism, the theological politics, and mixing it with the contemporary social science concept of colonial settlerism, colonial settler colonialism. So there it is, black and white. In other cases, you have to intuit it, you have to tease it out. There's also a Jewish case that's fascinating. The Zionist claim is, as you might think, is secular. Read the Declaration of Independence. Here they wrote and gave the Bible to the world. There's no Ma'amad Har-Sinai. There's no invocation that God gave the Torah or the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. The relationship between the divine and the people is not expressed anywhere in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. However, if you read the Jewish telegraphic version of the Declaration of Independence, it translates the Rock of Israel, Tzur Yisrael, which is the official translation of the State of Israel into Almighty God. And that has to do with the fact that there's a debate going on in Israel. What is the basis for the claim of contemporary Zionists to the land? And that debate was very much in evidence in the demonstrations that were taking place in the 6 months before October 7th over the place of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. Those who argue that the judicial reform was a revolution that was not warranted and was dangerous argued being faithful to the Declaration of Independence as a secular document. Those people who have problems with the Declaration and wish to diminish its importance try to transform that document into one with a religious motive. The fight over indigeneity, I'm not going to spend more time on it because I have to go much farther, is that the contemporary association of intellectuals, Israeli Arab intellectuals, created in 2007 4 different documents. The most popular one is the future vision of the Palestinian Arabs in Israel. And notice it begins with, we are the Palestinian Arabs in Israel, the indigenous peoples. And those peoples are the Druze, the Bedouins, the Sunnis, and anyone who of Muslim or of Christian faith, and the Jews are let out. So that the issue of indigeneity is a crucial, the use of history becomes a crucial crucible point of contention between the two national movements. What I'd like to do now is to switch to theological claims. What I want to say in brief, and if I had 5 hours, I could do it, is that there are many different secular claims. And if you can actually choose between many different kinds of claims and match them with many different theological claims. If there are multiple secular claims, I'd like to now turn to the multiple theological ones. Judaism, that's just for a moment in Judaism. The question isn't over where the Holy Land is. That's Eretz Yisrael, Eretz HaKodesh. That's the Holy Land. The question is, when may God's promise be fulfilled? By whom? By a Messiah? And if not by a Messiah, may the people engage in it? And how do they do it? Do they do it by waging war? Or if you adopt Martin Buber and Judah Magnus, or must the land be won in an ethical manner? That becomes the terms of the debate within Jews who hold to a Jewish perspective on how the land is to be claimed. Religious Zionism will tend to talk about the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria, and that's why it belongs to us. And one could go on. The Reform movement in America in the 19th century tried to deny nationalism and to diminish or eliminate the hyphen between being German Jews or American Jews, and in short, to meld themselves within the nationality of the places in which they lived, were first anti-Zionist, and increasingly in the 20th century, they become leading Zionists. Well, let me move on to Christianity. This is far more interesting and important to us, because ultimately it is the Christians who are going to determine, in the first stages at least, to whom Palestine or Israel, or to whom Palestine belongs. And the key issue is, does God still speak to the Jews? What's the place of the covenant? Is it the old covenant and then there's a new covenant? Does the old covenant still exist when the new covenant enters into force? Does the Jews still have a role in history? And if so, what is it? Do they still have a connection to the promised land, or what may it be? How you answer those questions determines what your political view towards Israel is, and what secular claim you might use joined to your theological view in making your argument. Because again, you will not go before the League of Nations, the United Nations, and say, I as a Christian believe X. Rather, you will use secular language. It begins with St. Augustine. St. Augustine had a famous meeting with Herzl in 1904. Herzl tried to
Not
persuade
Saint Augustine,
19, excuse me?
not Saint Augustine. The Pope.
No, so with the Pope, right. St. Augustine is the one who invented formulated supersessionism many 16 centuries ago. And it was that belief that was the regnant Christian view. And you can read here, Pope Pius in 1904 is telling Herzl, we can't give approval to this movement. We can't prevent the Jews from going to Palestine, but we can never sanction it. The earth of Jerusalem, if it was not always holy, has been made holy by the life of Jesus Christ. I, as head of the church, cannot possibly say otherwise. The Jews have not recognized our Lord. We therefore cannot recognize the Jewish people. What's fascinating about Christianity and of Islam is that as the discussion in the 20th century becomes alive with a new reality, that the land is no longer only Islamic, that the choice within all these religions is, to what extent do we remain faithful to traditional theology, or to what extent do we try to adapt it, or even find new theological formulations? So clearly, a century later, this is Pope Francis spends 5 days in Jerusalem, and he goes to Yad Vashem. But along the way, in 1964, as recently as 1964, the first modern pope to visit the Holy Land spends 11 hours there, never says the word Israel, thanks the authorities, but ignores the status of the president, and in many ways was very impolitic. John Pope Paul II visits for 5 days and so on. The great event is Nostra Aetate in 1964, 1965, in which the Roman Catholic Church changed its theological position. To some extent, that was a very modest change. There were those who would have wished for it to go further. I gave you the name on my screen, John Pawlikowski, who represents Catholic theologians who would urge that why not take the leap and not just give respect to the Jews that are no longer Christ killers, no longer deserve to be outside of history, in effect, colonial settlers, but to see God's claims to them as still valid, even as the claims to the new church also is valid. There can be multiple covenants. God is as large as that. I wrote in Red Roll of the Roman Catholic Church over 181. 181 is partition. I don't have time for that story, except to say that the Roman Catholic Church opposed the partition of Palestine, which meant a Jewish state, until October 1947. And the reason was they thought they could manipulate a Muslim state much better. They had long experience with that, and they could control or influence the British, a Protestant state, much better. They didn't know quite what the relationship with the Jewish state would be. When it turned out that 181 divided Palestine or partitioned Palestine not into 2 states, not into 3 states, a Jewish, an Arab, and an international condominium, which really meant a Christian control over Jerusalem, there was a lot of regret among Christian political leaders in different parts of the world. And you can read United Nations General Resolution 303 by the Lebanese Charles Malik, a very important figure who regretted the recognition given to the creation of a Jewish state. Remember that the Jewish state was approved by the United Nations by 1 vote to create a 2/3 majority. It was a block vote of all the Muslim states against, plus Cuba for other reasons, against the world in which the leading countries were largely Christian. Evangelicals, you know a lot about this. I would invite you someday to look up on YouTube the ceremony for the moving of the capital of Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and you'll find that the inaugural benediction was given by Robert Jeffries, and the final benediction by John Hagee. Both of them are evangelical pastors with mega churches in Texas. I mean, we're talking about 16 and 22,000 members in their churches respectively. And Hagee is particularly fascinating. He's created something called Christians United for Israel, 10 million members. They give more money annually than any Jewish federation in the United States. When you leave an airplane at Ben-Gurion Airport and go through the sleeve, you are seeing really people associated with them. Yael, oh my goodness, I forget her name, but people associated with Eckstein, and who was associated with Kufi, doing their work. They are crucial. It was the evangelicals who influence the American policy far more, I would argue, than the Jewish lobby. Who's really important at the time when the Jewish state was recognized were the mainline Protestants. That's far less true today. I've written two names for you. One is James Park, an English theologian who was active from the 1920s. And his history is really worthwhile. Very, very important individual who represents really but another instance of British theology crossing the Atlantic and influencing American theology. Among his correspondence are people like Heschel, leading rabbis in America, let alone Protestant theologians. And he argues that there's a double covenant. That is the revolutionary statement, one for Jews and another for Christians. In short, a Jewish state is validated theologically. I see Judaism and Christianity as equals. This is the most important person. And I wish I had an hour to talk about Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr was maybe the most important public theologian in the United States in the second half of the 20th century. It is he that gave the crucial testimony before the United Nations that judged the issue of partition. And he identifies himself both as a Christian and privately, he sees himself as a kind of Hebrew. He is to give a sense for his significance. The first and maybe the only time the Hebrew University's president and board and leaders gave an honorary degree to somebody outside, who was physically outside the state of Israel, was when they came to Tanglewood or Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where the Boston Symphony Orchestra plays, and they gave him an honorary degree. Present, by the way, was Norman Rockwell, and I wish that Norman Rockwell had left a painting of the event. But in short, Niebuhr was the hero of mainline Protestantism. Here is a large historical debate. Well, Truman made the recognition. Why? Because he was a Baptist. I can only tell you that the scholarship is very, very contested over what his motivations are. His partner was Eddie Jacobs, a Jew. Was it this group or that group? What made Harry Truman recognize a Jewish state? And I can only say that what we do know is that retrospectively, he turned to biblical sources and gave title to this book, I Am Cyrus, that I am responsible for the return of the Jews in the modern period, even as Cyrus was after the destruction of the first temple. We don't really know his motivation, though we can speculate. That's why how historians make a living. Islam, most important. You probably know more than I want to say or have time to say here about Islam. And the hostility of Islam to a Jewish state in what for 16 centuries had been in the abode of Islam. Of course, the shock was greater in Islam. The challenge was palpable, was real. And it's no accident that one will find the motif of Jews as crusaders, and that in the time to come, which isn't far, the crusaders will be expelled again from the Holy Land. And they were. And here's the person, Anwar Sadat, in 1977, coming to the Knesset to say no more war, in effect giving legitimacy to a Jewish state. So without spending time on the ways in which Islam has been hostile to Jewish equality and Jewish independence, now what's really important is on what basis could a Muslim Arab accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state? And you'll find that in the fatwa. Fatwa is a hechsher, is a legal document that gives a theological justification for action. This is worthwhile reading in entirety, and I only give you a short part of the fatwa. Sadat could not have gone to Jerusalem based upon realpolitik, normal secular politics. He had to go and give an explanation for his recognition of a Jewish state that was rooted in Islamic theology. Islam was and remains a religion of security and safety, peace and tranquility, serenity, amity and brotherhood, not a religion of war or conflict and hatred. It did not use the sword to dominate and control. Rather, its wars were a means to ensure the doctrine. The noble Quran ordered believers to refrain from fighting if it is not necessary, as written therein. So, if they hold aloof from you and wage not war against you and offer you peace, Allah allows you no way against them. Allah also said, if they incline to peace, incline thou also to it and trust in Allah. What I didn't put in here was that you may make peace with an infidel if you do it from strength, and that's after the 73 war, which was interpreted as a victory for Egypt. And also, if you get something for the treaty that you make with them, and what they got was a return of the Sinai and the promise of also mitigation of Jewish rule in Jerusalem. In short, there was a theological basis for making peace with a Jewish state, a total blasphemy for the 1300 years that go before. This you're all familiar with, the Hamas Charter, obliterate the Jews, kill the Jews. You can make a hudna, a temporary suspension of war, and peace with the Jewish state is not a theological possibility. I don't have to explain more than that. We're all witnessing it today. There's a 2017 charter. This, what I put up on the screen, is from 1988. But the 2017 charter does not disavow the 1988 one. Rather, it adds new reasons, which are largely voiced in secular language. There's an attempt to make Hamas into a modern national liberation movement, even as its base is a fundamentalist religious movement. What's the future of the relationship with Islamic states? Well, Abraham Accords of 2020. There's possibly a relationship with Saudi Arabia. Very importantly, what occurred on October 7th was that the Muslims and Christians, Arabs of Israel, did not join Hamas in creating some kind of rebellion within the country. Quite the contrary. And a part of that relates to the fact that is for all the complaints, and there are many, and indeed many that are justified, of Israeli Arabs, that they have become citizens and adjusted to a state of Israel. And here you have it, the Israeli Islamic movement, not the Gazan or the Palestinian, or ISIS or Boko Haram, or any one of the fundamentalist movements that have ravaged the Middle East and parts of Africa. The Israeli Islamic movement, Mansour Abbas, a man of the Islamic movement, he goes on to say, a proud Arab, a Muslim, I can function within an Israeli government and I can be an Israeli citizen. So revolution can exist even within Islam, contrary to popular myth, and it has certainly existed within Christianity. And had that not occurred, there would have been no legitimacy for a Jewish state in the 20th century. And this is an issue that goes on. I don't think I'm going to have time to even touch this, but you can look at any number of events the UN and the mobilization of Islamic groups and of leftist groups in lawfare, in various resolutions. And I'm going to leave it at that. Let me just say one word about new kinds of languages. By and large, in my understanding, the lexicon of languages and the principles were largely formulated between Balfour, the First World War, and into the 1950s. And what we have are new vessels, new ways of using the kinds of language and thoughts and theology and principles and entanglements between the secular and the religious through the present period. And some of it is very odd indeed. One of them is apartheid. I just have to comment on that. Since the 7th century, Jews lived under apartheid in Islamic countries, formally established theological, and that becomes the charge made against them today. I'm going to finish with this, and it's terribly important. What is occurring today in the state of Israel, and this is my own personal critique of Israeli politics, is that the secular language of the declarations, both the PLO Charter and the Israeli Declaration of Independence, are attempts to be secular, despite the overtones here and there of theology and religion, and the fact that it comes out of religious cultures, versus the openly, patent, manifestly religious Hamas Charter. But the current government and the current mobilizing force within Israel has departed from a reliance on secular argumentation to invoking and embracing theological. And if you would read the government guidelines, the first one is the Jewish people have an exclusive and indisputable right to all parts of the land of Israel. The government will promote and develop settlement in all parts of the land of Israel, the Galilee, the Negev, the Golan, and Judea and Samaria. In short, that one has created, if you think of the contest that's going on now, a theologically based movement, Hamas, contending with a Jewish national state that increasingly relies also often it attempts in a sentence, had early Zionists adopted the religious argument that this is the Holy Land and it belongs to us, because as Rashi claimed, it belongs to us, there never would have been a Jewish state. The first argument that appears in Basel, the first debate is over the 4 principles. And the first debate is over, should we adopt Zionism seeks to secure for the Jewish people a publicly recognized, legally secured homeland in Palestine. What's fascinating about that is the word publicly. The majority, there was opposition to having Zionism as a public movement. And the majority was maintained when the word öffentlich, openly or publicly, was introduced, and it was explained that you couldn't rely upon a philanthropist. You couldn't rely upon one state. You couldn't rely upon a benefactor. If there was to be a legitimate Jewish state, it somehow had to be anchored into the principles and the culture that operate in the politics, the international politics and legal systems of the modern world. And the challenge that Israel faces today is that should it depart from that decision to fundamentally base its claims on a secular discourse and adopt a religious discourse, you can rest assured that it will raise the concerns of alternative and opposing theological discourses, and the 14 million, let alone the 7 million Jews who happen to be in Israel, don't have the numbers, don't have the powers, hopefully don't have even the will to try to engage in that kind of context, that Israel was able to become established because it was, however it grew over the centuries, and it grew out of a religious culture, was able to adopt and to adapt secular discourse to the imperatives of what its historic religious culture imagined as possible, and to which so many of the adherents of Zionism held to, no matter how attenuated their Judaism may have been. So I think that that is probably as good a place as to end. Okay.
Great. Ilan, thank you for that comprehensive and that rich, thorough analysis of the very thoughtful book, and obviously something that I encourage everybody should be encouraged to read more into. There's a lot to discuss, and obviously, so with the time that we have a short amount of time for some Q&A. The floor is now open, but let me have Alex ask the first question, and then we'll take it from there. Alex.
Sure. Well, first of all, Ilan, thanks very much for a very, very stimulating presentation, and which covered a tremendous amount of ground. I really want to go back to one of your initial points, and that has to do with the very concept of secular versus religious. And I have to say that I no longer believe in this distinction, which seems to me to be a kind of 1960s modernist or post-war modernist contrivance. And I think this is something that, in fact, you were saying in a different way with your emphasis on narratives and the shifting of language within narratives across, well, really 2,000 years. And you can begin with Augustine, you could begin with the Gospels, rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar, I know, in some broader conceptual sense, and various adaptations of language over the millennia, but certainly over the last 200 years, to different kinds of intellectual paradigms, the Enlightenment paradigm, the nationalist paradigm, we could call it, of the 19th, late 18th, certainly the 19th and 20th centuries, with various kinds of emphases. So maybe there is no such thing as secular, and this is going to be my question to you. Maybe secular is simply a myth, and that what we're talking about are different emphases in belief and manifestations of belief and identity and behavior, which use different kinds of language as adaptations from their audience in their audiences. And to circle back to your very, very last point, what we see now in Israel and lots of other places is the resurgence of what appears to be religious language, which people rightly and wrongly, for better and for worse reasons, applaud or condemn. But maybe it's all the same thing. Maybe these are the same passions which are being simply linguistically shifted, and that our very concept of secularism as something good or bad is the embrace of a mythology, and that okay, I could go on. I'll leave it to you.
First of all, I wish you would. And second of all, I agree with you. I think that's what this book is really about. I don't know if they're the same. I don't think they're the same, because secularism does have a history, is a category, and so is religion. And the difference has to do with, what are your sources for epistemology? How do you learn about the world? It's revealed religion against science in one kind of formulation. Can people hold on to both, and which becomes dominant, I think is my question. And I come to that exactly from where you were suggesting. In the 1960s, it was Peter Berger, who I invoked earlier, who wrote a famous book that arguing is that modernism inexorably leads to secularization. His last book, written a few years ago, just before he passed on, said that I was wrong. And I would tie that one could live with. By the way, he learned from Eisenstadt the notion of multiple modernities, that you could have multiple consciousnesses and kinds of cultures coexisting in the same society. It doesn't have to be either or. How we learn about truth and how we learn about the world is not a binary. There's an interesting book from which I also learned from, and goes along with what I think you're suggesting, Alex. And that's Wals's book around 6 years ago on revolutions and counter-revolutions. He asked the question, explain how come Nehru, who was a thoroughgoing, avowed, now that's his analysis of himself, secularist, Ben Bella, who was a secularist, anti-Islamist, and Ben-Gurion, who never would have claimed that he was a religious Jew and flaunted aspects of Jewish ritual and culture. How come all of them became leaders of a modern country that was based avowedly on secular values, but their successors are contending with societies in which religion or religious impulses have reasserted themselves? I would add Turkey. After all, Ataturk was probably one of the most avowed public secularists of the 20th century. And look at what you have there now. The point is that beneath the surface, and what the relationship between the surface and the subterranean is really an interesting question. How thin is the separation? How intertwined are they? And what I've tried to do here is to look what I call at the tangle between the two, and to try to tease out what the tangle is. And sometimes one may be more dominant than the other, but never is one extinguished entirely. Ben-Gurion never succeeded, never even tried really, to suppress entirely religious culture. And it may not work quite the other way, but and neither did Nehru try to do the same thing, and Ben Bella certainly. All of them failed. America, religion, separation of church and state in the United States of America today, abortion, public behavior, values. What I learned by being with Peter Berger, frankly, he brought in people from China, the Soviet Union, Africa, all over the world. And it was a succession of testimonies of how the country or the culture in which I live is not reduced to one or the other, but the extent to which both of them coexist in different kinds of degrees. And what's fascinating to watch is when one narrative, one kind of culture contends with the other and begins to gain a measure of, if not dominance, at least prominence.
So maybe what we're talking about then is culture and not religion or science.
Oh.
It's a multivalent kind of phenomenon that is always dynamic.
It is.
And
Yes, and that culture is not either or secular. I would buy that. But the place to look is religion, because again, I think what's really fundamental is the epistemology, is what are your sources of authority?
okay, well, I'm tempted to push back with some French structural Marxism and superstructure and infrastructure and stuff like that. But let's try and take at least one or two questions before our time is up, and we only have a very few minutes. Asaf, do you have one of these questions in mind? I'm trying to look through my spectacles at the list here.
Let's take Dina Feder's question. And so Ilan, so Dina is asking, how can we hope for a secular to be the foundation if the demography of Israel is moving in a direction of a religious state? And so comments about demographic and birth rate issues that are playing currently today in Israel.
Well, as the father of 6 children, I have to tell you is that, and who doesn't get an emolument each month from because they go to yeshiva. I Demographic trends are not the best of all possible guides. I also don't see they're not what 20% of the population is now religious. But that's not a fair thing. I have to go back to Alex. 80% of the people in Israel, according to a poll done by the um, by an Institute of Public Opinion, light candles on Friday night. People say Kiddush, and then the next day they go to a soccer game, or they go to Lod Airport and they go and on an airplane and eat fruits de mer and what other kind of delicacies they can find offered on a flight. There is it's difficult to categorize all of this. I would not define it in terms of attendance at synagogue. That's also not real. I go to a shul on Shabbat when I go to a shul on Shabbat, where I assure you that the members go and daven in the morning, but in the afternoon they're barbecuing at the beach. The behavior is far more mixed. And there are a lot of people in Israel who give credence to and enjoy religious culture, religion, but also are devoted to democratic principles. There is not to view this as an apposition is just wrong. Yosef Berg, religious Zionism at one time was deeply, deeply committed to liberal values and to liberal politics, and that to assume that reading and learning and knowing the Talmud makes one into a right-wing conservative is just not experience. It's not true. So I don't know that the future of Israel is to become ever more theocratic state. Let me give you one speech. It's a little bit off the point, but it's important. One of the most important events in my education was watching Avi Ravitsky and Hanan Porat debate at Van Leer. Avi Ravitsky was one of the premiers, or a premier scholar of Jewish thought, and Hanan Porat was one of the leaders of Gush Emunim. And Hanan said, Israel is going to be a state governed by halakha, and the Mashiach is going to come. And Avi got up and said, I believe that the Mashiach will come. And yes, halakha will be the law of the state. But the difference between you and me is, when that is going to happen and by whom. I don't. So Avi Ravitsky was one of the founders of Meimad. And Avi Ravitsky and Hanan Porat was a leader of Gush Emunim. In short, even to those who read the same Talmud and have the same appreciation for it, there is no necessary one conclusion of what they will draw from their religion, nor of their secularism. There are many secularists who hold the similar political views, but from entirely different sources, of why the state of Israel must be a Jewish exclusive state. So it's more than a binary. There are multiple entanglements here between religious and secular thought. That's why I did the book. And I can't do it in the 30-second response to the kinds of questions that are being asked.
Well, good. Alex, do you have another question that you want to follow up here?
I have many questions, but I think maybe given the time that this is getting to be a good place to stop, and it's also stopping on a hopeful note, that people are complicated, life is complicated, nothing is set in stone, the future is not written, and we shouldn't give up.
Alex, the only thing that's in stone are the tablets.
That is true.
If we could only find that.
I'll I bring you these 15, no, 10 commandments, as the movie says. We can't thank you enough for doing this.
Thank you.
We look forward to having you again on this topic, other related topics, and to seeing you in November at the annual conference of SPME, and to seeing all of our many other guests today on the next SPME and SPME webinars, which are coming up soon. I don't have the schedule in front of me, but check your emails, and we will be in touch shortly.
Thank
Great.
you very much. And
Thank you both. Thank you, Ilan, again for a really great conversation. We will talk soon. Thank you, everybody, for attending this afternoon, and look out for future webinars. And we will see everybody soon. Thank you, Ilan.
Bye-bye.
Oh, good job.
Hmm?
Amazing.
Thanks, Ilan.
Okay, was that okay?
Wonderful. I'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye-bye.